My grandfather on my father's side, he was a member of the ASC, the Army Service Corps, and he was one of the first to enlist as a civilian, and he joined up in March 1915. And for a start, his occupation at the time, he was a master coach builder. So his first job was to build huts on the Salisbury Plain. And he sent a letter from there to my grandmother saying it was amazing the thousands and thousands and thousands of men who were camped on Salisbury Plain, all ready to go to France.
My grandfather, John William Leaning, who served in the East Riding Yeomanry in the First World War, he joined in Hull on the 9th of November 1914. He joined as a territorial, as they all did in those days, and after he completed his training, he then embarked to the Middle East, which was Alexandria was the ship's destination, on the 27th of October 1915, arriving in Alexandria on November the 10th, 1915. He served around Gaza, Alexandria and Cairo, and then the whole regiment was centred around that Middle Eastern area for the whole of the war.
My granddad, James Knight, was my mother's father. He served in the Lincolnshire Regiment, 1st and 5th Links, but originally he was a territorial, joined up in 1911 and was in the British Expeditionary Force, the first lot to go to France basically, because there was trained soldiers. My other granddad, Robinson, Fred, he went in the Royal Navy at 14 as a junior midshipman and served right the way through, and then halfway through the war, when his Navy service had finished, he went in the Coast Guard, which was controlled at that time by the Royal Navy. And my great uncle, that's Grandad Fred's youngest brother, Sidney Jack, he was he originally joined the Lincolnshire Regiment and then transferred over to the Machine Gun Corps. But I suppose as a family we're quite fortunate because all three came home alive. You know, where some families lost relatives, we was lucky we got them all back, which is sort of a feat in itself.
My grandfather was just a ordinary private soldier. I suppose like a lot of other young people, they volunteered. As to whether my granddad did or whether he was called up, I've no idea. Well, he was on the Somme with the Lincolnshire Regiment, and my mum told me they were sheltering one night in the Albert Cathedral, which got heavily bombed, and Grandad was one of the lucky ones. There was quite a few killed, and he was knocked unconscious, and when he came round, he had a silver crucifix with mother of pearl beads at the side of him, and he picked this crucifix up and carried it with him all through the war, and he said that's what got him through the war, and then after the war he brought it home.
Grandad joined the Leicesters, not the Lincolnshires as I thought he would have done, possibly due to his fact that he was a marksman, and he did tell me he went for special training down at Bisley. He was home on leave in 1917, and when he went back to France, unbeknown to him, my grandmother was pregnant. He went back to his unit in northern France, and they were holed up around a farm called Vaucelet Farm, near to the village of Epinay, just north of the Somme. And one day, he and a couple of his buddies, him being a sniper stroke scout, went off on a recce into the countryside, and when they returned 2 or 3 days later, there was nobody left at the farm apart from bodies. The whole German front line had advanced in the time they were away. unbeknown to them. How it missed them, I don't know.
On my mother's side, her father, I don't know so much about him. He was a very quiet man who didn't talk a lot about it. Mind you, I think things were so horrific that they didn't want to remember. He was with the Royal Engineers, and he was just a sapper. And I have a postcard which my grandmother sent to him, sent to France on active service, and it said on it, she was very sorry for the letter that she'd sent, but things do get you down. So you can imagine in families the problems that there were both at home and the horrific conditions that the men were fighting under.
He started as a standard soldier. That was his training, but later he transferred into the Machine Gun Corps. Now then, the Machine Gun Corps in those days was known as the Suicide Squad, because they were the first aim of any enemy embarkment was to take out the machine gunners, because they were the ones that were capable of multi-death. So it was always the Machine Gun Corps on both sides that were the first aim of the artillery and of the soldiers.
My grandmother, on my father's side, she had a brother who actually was with the Lincolnshire Yeomanry, which is a little bit unusual. And he was on a ship bound for Gallipoli with a hold full of horses, because obviously that was his job. He looked after horses and rode them. They had a farm in Brigg, and my great-grandfather was an ostler, so they were used to horses. And unfortunately, the ship that he was on was torpedoed, and all the horses were just captive in the hold. And unfortunately, the noise of the horses when they were drowning, because obviously they couldn't get out, he was saved, but it preyed on his mind, and he became very unstable and was never the same person again, which I think typifies a lot of the trauma that all these men suffered in the conditions that they were probably never ever realised what they were going to.
He had what he called during his life by the grace of God go I moment, when he heard the shell come over. It landed feet away from his machine gun placement, but the shell never went off. And part of his folklore that he told us during his life, that if this shell ever went off, there'll be no leanings really to tell the story, because he would have gone, we would never be here.
When my grandmother, back in England, got the word from the army that my grandfather was missing, presumed dead, near this Vorselet farm, she decided on having the child, which was a new daughter, to call her Vorselet. However, Grandad was missing, but not dead, and he made his way back through the German lines back to British units, and was finally shipped back to England and back to North Lincolnshire, where he saw his new baby daughter, Vorselet.
I think, according to his diaries, they spent a lot of time looking what the enemy were doing, and also on reconnaissance. I don't think he felt particularly vulnerable, but there were times when he had the horses from the yeomanry were bombarded and soldiers were killed around him. Those are the type of period where he did feel as though, yes, even though at 18, 19, 20-year-old, you're still vulnerable. You're still going down the line of, can I survive this war? But those were his thoughts, according to his diary.
The tragic day for Barton as a town, 13th of October 1915, at the Battle of Lewes, called Hollison's Redoubt, where Barton lost quite a lot of men on that day. I think 15 in total died, a known fact, but some later on. But on that fateful day, there was 11 officers got killed, 234 men was killed, and 175 was seriously wounded. And I know a Company Sergeant Major Burgess, when they did the roll call, of the 35 men in his platoon, there was only 3 answered the call. So that is quite, that's 32 men out, of really young men, very young men. Barton in total lost 164 men in the First World War, which is quite a big sacrifice for a town, I suppose, at that time maybe had a population of just below 5,000. So it was quite a percentage, of young men. It was like the up-and-coming youth, well, not youth, but the next generation of fathers-to-be, And my granddad always said the most tragic day of his life when he came home after Redoubt, when he came home on leave because he'd been gassed, that was all the wives and girlfriends and mothers and all waiting at Barton Station wondering what had happened to the relatives, So I mean, it must have been traumatic for him, and that's what he said, even though the horrors of war, what he'd seen. On his pension, I've found some pension records, and it says perforation of the eardrum and GSW, which is gunshot wounds, but that could be shrapnel. It's not necessarily a rifle bullet, it can be shrapnel damage, My granddad Jim, he was discharged in March 1919 because he'd been wounded 3 times somewhere along his military career. In the records it states gunshot wounds. We know he was gassed once, and the other one it just says lacerations to the arm, so it's very vague. Grandad Fred Robinson in the Navy, when he finished his naval career and the Coast Guard career, he was working as a rigger up in Berwick-on-Tweed because that was his last station, and then he came home to Barton in 1921 to die because he had cancer of the throat, uncurable cancer, but the knowledge at that time was not like it is today. And Sidney Jack, he came back, and Sidney Jack rejoined the Territorials in 1922. After because he liked the shooting aspect of it, but also brought in some extra cash for the family to bring up family. And Sidney Jack, in his later life, suffered very bad with trench foot, because of the horror of the trenches and the wet and the thing. But lived to be quite a good age, did Sidney, and he worked at the cycle works, along as my Grandad Knight, Grandad Jim, he worked at the cycle works, because you find when we've been doing the research, it says occupation, cycle worker, just continually. So Mr. Hopper, in his heyday, you can understand in the 1916-17 era, he was losing a lot of his skilled craftsmen going to war, because he was doing government contracts, so he was taking out one lot, some of his business money, if you like. So he didn't like that at all, even though he was king and country.
My grandfather, who was with the Army Service Corps, who was a coach builder, he went back, he was a master coach builder, and he went back to working still with wood, but of course after the war, coaches were no longer the mode of transport, and we'd moved on to cars and buses, and he used to make the bodies for Ford cars. The place where he worked, the coach works, changed over and were making the bodies, and they made them out of ash mainly, and he was doing that. And then after that he left there because I think he's probably a little bit tired of doing that, and he worked making bus bodies, which was quite a much bigger concern, and finished up designing. He did actually design a bus. So yes, he was, as I say, he was a craftsman, and he did go back to what he was doing. My other grandfather, as I say, he was just a manual worker, and he went back to just manual work, working in the tileries at Barton. As he became a little less able, he actually worked on the bowling green in Barton, but yes, just initially went back to doing manual work.
My granddad he used to have a cobbler's shop in the cottage that he lived in Oakley Clay, Beacon Cottage, which is no longer there, and he used to repair shoes around the village. But what I can remember of him, mostly he was in his garden. He loved his garden. He had quite a large garden with some lovely vegetables.
Well, he returned in 1919, where he was demobbed at a place called Clipston in Derbyshire. His demob papers show that they were given 2 weeks' pay, and then they were expected to find a job within the 2 weeks, which he did. He come back, and when he come back to Barton, his first job, he went self-employed. His first job was to lead coal from what was the coal at the railway station in Barton to the gasworks. Now then, the folklore that he told us was he brought his war horse back from the Middle East, a horse called Captain, and that horse survived right the way through up to the Second World War. And Captain was the start of his business career, first in haulage, and then he went into farming, into milk production, and he went into milk production right the way into the 1950s, and then more into general agriculture.
My mother knew nothing about what he did in the war, nothing at all. And I have heard other families say that their relative who was in the war never spoke about it, wouldn't speak about it. I think things were too horrendous. My father's uncle, who was with the yeomanry and was torpedoed, it affected him so badly. I don't know whether this is true because in the time I've been given, I haven't been able to research this, but my auntie told me that he did finish up committing suicide in the barn of the farm that they had in Brigg, because he's so badly mentally affected. My grandfather, East, he was the sort of man who wouldn't be. He was a strong-willed man, and I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't be mentally affected. But he was very, I don't know what really the right word to use is. He was strict with the children, and they had to do exactly what he told them. He wouldn't stand any nonsense. I remember him as a little child, and if there was something wrong and you complained, he would say, well, the child must have done something. He didn't have a lot of sympathy, and I think maybe his war experience probably made him like this, that he saw so much that little things like a dog biting you, especially as the child, it was a child and the child must have done something. He didn't seem to have a lot of sympathy for people.
Well, grandfather never really talked about the First World War. In the probably late 50s, I did ask him, I said, Grandad, you was in the 14-18 war. I said, what was it like? And he said, it was hell, Jack. As he always called me Jack. And that's about all he ever said to me as regards the war. Apart from that, all the stories I've got were relayed back to me by my mother. To me, he was always jovial. He liked to go to the pub for a pint. He was never down in the dumps, to my knowledge. So I would say no. But people that was in that war obviously kept a lot back. They didn't talk about it, so...
Nobody talked about it, and that is the sad part about it. The Second World War, people are now, you know, even though they're in their 80s, they're now starting to talk about it. But First World War veterans was very reluctant to say anything. All the people I've interviewed have said, well, my father never mentioned anything. Because I think the horrors of war in the First World War was a lot, it was terrible.
The fact is, when he came back from the war, I mean, obviously I wasn't around then, but when I was of an age to understand what had been going on, he never really spoke about it too much. He was a very quiet man. And I never asked him the right questions, which I should have done. But at that age, you've got your own life to lead, and you always leave these things till it's too late. But he was a very quiet man. Of course, that generation, born in the 1890s, were involved with two wars. The first one, which they were involved in directly in fighting, and of course the Second World War, their sons and daughters were involved with, especially the sons with going off in the Marines and the Army away to foreign lands again. So he never really talked about it at all. So I can't really say if it changed him or not, because he was a very quiet person anyway.
Yeah, World War II, two main roles really. Barton was very much involved, as in every town, was with fundraising for the war effort. And Barton was instrumental in raising over 40,000 to buy what was known as the big gun. Like, even now, Barton is renowned for its generosity. When the chips are down, Barton people will respond. So he was very much involved in fundraising for that. He was also involved in the Home Guard and very much enjoyed watching programmes on the television relating to Home Guard, particularly Dad's Army. He could very much relate to Dad's Army, how they performed and didn't perform. His story was always, remember he was fighting with horses and machine guns, where in the Second World War it was more based with more modernised machinery and lorries and tanks and everything else, which he related back to how he fought, which was handguns and machine guns and horses and carriages and artillery town across sand. But he felt as though he should be there. I still think my granddad wished he was still there among the muck and bullets. That was the thought, that was the impression I always got when I talked to him, or when he talked to me. I was very much a listener rather than a talker in those days. And but some of his tales were always about what I've been talking about, the Middle East and the efforts that he put in.
Fond memories. Every time I went to my grandmother's house and granddad's, made most welcome. And he advised me a lot about when I first went to sea, how to meet other nationalities, etc., etc. So I have a lot of fond memories of my granddad and my grandmother, and I miss them so much, but life goes on.